Good morning and welcome to the Wednesday, June 24th, 2009 edition of the Investigative Journal. I'm your host, Greg Szymanski. You're listening to LibertyRadioLive.com, and my guest today is Noreen Gosch. And Noreen, it's been way too long since Noreen Gosch has been on my program, so we're going to start from the beginning and tell the whole story about what happened to her son, Johnny Gosch. Earlier last week, and at the bottom of the hour, Jim Rothstein, a New York police detective, will join us to add some things to this story. He's been working with Noreen after he left the New York Police Department to try and locate Johnny and to uncover really what happened to him when on September 5th, 1982, Johnny was delivering his papers for the Des Moines Register, and that began a 23-year search after he was kidnapped. And Noreen is one of the only mothers in this country that has stood up to the federal authorities, has stood up to the lies she's been told to get to the truth. Many people break down, can't handle it, because this is a story that is not just an isolated incident of one boy, a young boy, being taken off his paper route and put into a child abduction ring, a child pornography ring. It is a really serious problem in this country that gets repeated over and over and over again. Noreen is with us today to explain that, and we're going to start from the beginning. I just want to make sure Noreen's with us. How are you, Noreen?
I'm good. Thank you for having me on the program this morning.
Okay, let's get to the reason I want to start all over again is it's been way too long since you've been on the show with me, and I want to let our listeners, I want to refresh their memories. Plus, I want to tell this story from the beginning because, as I said, this story is probably being repeated somewhere in this country right as we speak. We need to understand how these child pedophile rings operate, who's behind them, and no one better to tell us the story than you. Tell us how this began on September 5th, 1982.
Okay. On September 5th, my son Johnny got up and went out of the house to do his paper route. And it was a normal Sunday. He would pull his wagon up to the corner, which was about a block away, load his papers, and then start folding them. And the paper drop was where a number of other paper boys also gathered in the morning. That morning, Johnny headed up to the paper drop. He had our little dog with him, and he got part way there, and a man pulled up alongside the curb and stopped and asked for direction. Johnny did not stop and talk to the man. He continued on to the appropriate corner, and this information was all supplied to us by witnesses.
Okay.
Johnny got to the corner, and by the time he got there, the man had made a U-turn in the middle of the street, went back up, and then pulled his car in where all the boys were folding their papers. He shut off his engine. He opened his passenger door and swung his feet out onto the curb. Another man pulled up with his car, and he was a 44-year-old attorney in Des Moines who was picking up his son's papers. That man is now a judge here. He threw his son's papers in the car, noticed this other man sitting there, and then drove away. The man who had pulled up asking for directions began to ask the boys all for directions again. And by this time, there were 3 boys at the corner gathering up their bundles to deliver. Johnny said to one of the other boys, "There's something weird about this guy. I'm scared. I'm going home right now." And Johnny pulled his wagon and took off down the street towards home.
Okay. And how far was that from your home? That drop-off point, how far was it from your house?
Only a block.
Okay.
Yeah, just one block.
Go ahead.
Johnny got partway down the street, and the man in the car suddenly pulled his feet in, closed the passenger door, started the engine, but before he took off, he reached up and he flicked the dome light on and off 3 times. and then pulled away. At the point that he flicked the dome light, another man came out from between two houses and a group of trees and kind of fell in behind Johnny, a few feet behind him, and followed him down the street and around the corner. At that point, I doubt very much whether Johnny even realized he was being followed.
Okay.
Because the man was just so silent. The other paper boy noticed how tall this man was and didn't think anything of it because nobody knew a crime was in progress. Johnny went around the corner and out of sight. Moments later, another boy who was in his house, in his bedroom, heard a noise outside, and he looked out, and he saw Johnny being shot with some type of stun gun or something that caused him to drop to the ground. At that point, the man who had been on foot following him and someone who was in the back seat of the car who jumped out, one grabbed his feet, one grabbed his shoulders and arms. They tossed him in the car, and then they jumped in, and the car sped away, running the stop sign, heading north towards the interstate. They went a few blocks, and they pulled into another street where there was a van. The van was parked with the motor running. They pulled up. They transferred Johnny's body to the van, and then both vehicles split up and went different directions out of town. Okay. This has taken us years to put all these pieces together. We brought in private detectives who canvassed the area and questioned everybody in a several-mile radius of our home. And so we had pieces of all of this from years ago, and then our big break came when someone did confess to his part in the kidnapping, and he knew certain details that we had never made public, which we had learned through all of our interviews.
And was that Paul Bonacci?
Yes, it was Paul Bonacci, and it was 9 years after
I'm going to get into his testimony in a moment, but let's go back to that first day. Okay. Because while Johnny now was being kidnapped, of course, you were at home. You weren't aware of it yet. How long was it after Johnny was missing that you were made aware of his disappearance?
Johnny left the house at 10 minutes to 6, and we were notified about a little after 6:30 because neighbors had not received their papers. So the kidnappers had about a half an hour lead time.
All right. Now, here's one of the interesting points, and I want to start with this because there was information even that first day from eyewitnesses that Johnny had been kidnapped, but yet the police, the local police, decided not to do anything and to claim that he was a runaway. Now, explain the evidence that you had that first day, which should have alerted the police to basically call this a kidnapping and start searching with the information that you had and others of his abductors. Go ahead.
That's exactly right. When I called the police department, after we were notified that neighbors didn't get their papers, Johnny's father ran out to help him, thinking he was just running late. He came back to the house and said, "Johnny's gone. His wagon is sitting up at the corner loaded with papers." He didn't even get the bundle cut. And I called the police right away, and it took them 45 minutes to get to our house. During that 45 minutes, I made phone calls to the district manager of the Des Moines Register, found out the names of all the boys that picked up their papers that morning, including the attorney. I called all their homes, and I had all the information about the type of car, the color of the car, what the man looked like, what he was wearing. I had everything written down by the time the police arrived. I told the cop all of this information, gave him what the witnesses had told me, and the cop stood in my kitchen, looked at me, and said, "Yeah, well, has your son ever run away before?" And I said, "Didn't you hear me?" I said, "This is what the witnesses are telling us." There were 5 witnesses, each witnessing a portion of this kidnapping. Well, he said, "We're not going to call it a kidnapping." I said, well, what exactly are you going to call it? And he said, well, for the time being, a runaway. He's that age. And I just could not believe what I was hearing. And it took months to get that changed.
Yeah, and I can't believe that. And I doubt if the people that were giving you the information could believe the police did that. And I doubt whether the listeners can believe that these policemen would operate that way.
Well,
I know I even have former policemen that listen to my show, and I know they're thinking we wouldn't have done that. Now, here's exactly what you told them. You had the make of the car. You had eyewitnesses showing that he was abducted. You also had maybe not. Did you have the information of the stun gun yet, or did that come later?
The stun gun came later.
Okay, but you had enough information. The make of the car. You even had a credible witness, an attorney who now is a judge, who saw this, saw part of this kidnapping unfold. Yet the police did nothing. So continue. I mean, you must have put up some big stink at that point. Tell us how that day progressed.
Well, I did, and then when that cop left, we didn't see another policeman at our home until afternoon. And so I got on the phone right away and started calling family and friends all through the whole area, asking them to organize search parties and go to desolate areas, the state park, any place where people might go to a remote area to commit a crime or dump a body. So we started our own search teams before the cops ever came back to our home. While the police were gone, they did go to the witnesses' houses, but they didn't even so much as bring in a tablet or a clipboard with which to write down what the witnesses were saying. One of the mothers of one of the other paper boys called me and said, I can't believe this. The cop didn't even bring in a clipboard or a tablet to write anything my son said about what happened to Johnny. Nothing.
Well, yeah, it sounds like to me they're dragging their feet. Now, what? Just, it's obvious. We've talked about this before, but it's obvious that somebody must have told these police officers to stand down. And what have you found out since about the actions of, we're just going to talk about your local police force, and name the police force and who the people were involved and what you found out.
Okay. The police force was the West Des Moines Police Department, and the police chief was a man by the name of Orville Cooney. And he was the one calling the shots. He went out to one of the state parks where the searchers were. He was drunk. He got up on a picnic table and used a bullhorn and said to the people, everybody go home. This kid is nothing but a blankety-blank runaway. And he used the four-letter word.
Okay.
And the reason I know this took place is because that group of searchers came back to our house, and there was 23 of them. They were very, very angry, and they came to our house and said, I thought you wanted our help. And I said, we do. And then they told me what the police chief did. And I couldn't believe that a police chief would sabotage a search effort for a child. Then the police chief came over to our home, and he told us not to talk to the media, not to talk to anyone, just stay in our house. Well, no one tells me to do anything like that when it comes to my child. Absolutely no one. I don't hear the word no when it comes to something like this. And I just pushed right on and did what I had to do. I called the press. I started making phone calls. I was proactive from that, totally. I could see we weren't going to get any help from the police. I kept asking them to call the FBI in. They would not do so. So I called the FBI office myself. They sent 2 agents over to the house. They both sat at the kitchen table slurping down coffee. And they said, well, we're not going to be entering the case because the police chief called us and told us he wasn't going to need our help because your son was just a runaway. And besides that, we have no crime. You have to prove to us that Johnny's life is in danger. This went against everything that I ever thought about America, about how crimes were investigated, crimes against children. And what I thought and what I believed in was smashed to bits within hours. There was nothing left of a belief system because now it was in our hands. It was do it yourself or forget you ever had a child because nobody else was going to do it. And that's
right.
pure and simple what happened in West Des Moines, Iowa. Many years later, I always suspected complicity because I didn't think they were that stupid. I just figured they were covering for someone. And it turned out I was right. We have since learned of involvement of somebody within that police department. And he is now dead. His heart attacked him and he died. But that's what I suspected from day one. It was a gnawing feeling. I can't explain it, but I knew this is not the way it's supposed to go.
No, not the way it's supposed to go when you have credible eyewitnesses stating that they have IDs on the car, the make of the car, the people involved, Johnny's wagon sitting there, the dog running home probably. I mean, this is not a runaway. This is a situation where the police should have been on it within minutes and searching for that car, putting an all-points bulletin out, blocking the freeways. But what they did was they someone was alerted at the top level, that police chief, it looks like. He then told everyone to stand down, giving these people who were working for somebody higher up the chance to get away. And as Jim Rothstein will be with us in the second half hour to add some things, a police
Jim
detective
can fill in the blanks there.
Right, who's researched this, said that's exactly what they need. They need a 48-hour window to get out of town. So in order that they can then basically, once that window's gone, it's very difficult to trace what happened, correct?
That's correct. And I will have to say the police chief, when I would ask a question, he would tell me that it was none of my concern. If I pressed for a question, I'm a very calm person and very respectful of people. And when I would ask a question, if he didn't like it, he would begin yelling at me. And I would look at him each time and I would say, there is no need for you to raise your voice and yell. I have perfect hearing. Well, then the man would go ballistic. The man was not in control of himself whatsoever. And every time, by being calm and just being real solid and steady, I could get him to go over the edge. And I knew he was hiding something.
Exactly. So tell us how this progressed, the days to follow, because you were basically trying to awaken the authorities to what happened. They didn't help you. Tell us how this progressed in the early days and how it basically eventually evolved into your fight alone almost, and with the help of others from the private sector who've come to your rescue, and how it led to him, your son. You never seeing your son again until his late 30s, and this is an amazing story, but tell us those first few days, what went on, and how these policemen just didn't do their job.
No, they did not, and FBI as well. And I realized that it was up to us. And so I immediately started putting feelers out to find a private investigator. I did find one, interviewed him. He came on board, brought other investigators in to start canvassing the area to do all the interviews. The very first day on the job, the West Des Moines police arrested our private investigators.
That I never heard before. That is incredible.
They took them to jail, and they hadn't done anything wrong, but they said that they needed to clarify what they were actually doing here because it would frighten people. So they arrested our private investigators. Well, at that point, I was livid, and I went to the police department, and the men were carrying letters from me authorizing them to be investigating, so that if neighbors had a question when they would knock on the door, they knew that this was part of this investigation and they were working for me. Okay. So the police did everything they could to throw obstacles in my path. Then there was a small article in the paper about two other girls, age 13 and 14, that were taken from Des Moines about the second week of September. after Johnny's kidnapping. The girls were found over in Omaha. The men fit the same description as the ones that took Johnny. And the girls were found in prostitution that they were put into over there, but they were rescued and brought back to Des Moines.
Okay.
I took that article to the police chief, and I asked him if he would please call Robert Wadman, who was the police chief of Omaha, and ask about it, since Omaha was only 2 hours away, and the men fit the same description. The police chief looked at me, and he said, no, he says, I don't have a feel for that. So then I went to the FBI office. No, they wouldn't. I went to the state police, called the DCI here. They wouldn't either. So then I called the press, and I did a press conference. And I wanted to ask the public for their help and demand to know why none of these agencies would at least make a phone call to Omaha to check on the facts in that case to see what else might match our case. Within an hour after I did that press conference, I received a phone call. It was a man with a raspy voice, and he said, if you don't quit rocking the boat, you're going to die. And that was my first death threat. And so I sat there and I thought, okay, what boat did I rock? The only one I can think of is that I pointed the finger towards Omaha, Nebraska, way back in the day before the Franklin scandal broke. And they were terrified that I might actually find something. And they had to try to stop me in some way, so then the death threats and other harassment began. At that point, the police chief made a press release to the Des Moines Register saying that the Gosches were nothing but damn stupid people, and that it was none of our concern to be investigating this case. And he actually swayed public opinion against us, and it became very difficult here because as rumor mills began, if you've got the police saying, don't help the family, nobody's going to help the family. And that's what he did. So with him at the helm, nothing was going right on this case. Nothing. So after a couple months of this, I called all of the members of the city council on a Friday afternoon, and I told them that on Monday morning I was filing a $20 million lawsuit for negligence and naming the police chief. By Monday morning, there was a big article in the paper with his picture that the police chief was resigning due to stress on the Gosch case. And I found out that they had an illegal city council meeting in the basement of the police department to try and decide what to do after I threatened to sue. But I did not intend to sue. My accomplishment was to get him out of office so I no longer had to deal with this man that was covering up on the case.
Unbelievable. And this occurred how long after your son was kidnapped?
That took place within probably 8 weeks after I got rid of the police chief. And then
Noreen?
About a month after the police chief was gone, he was arrested for stealing.
All right, we are back for the second half hour of the Investigative Journal. My guest is Noreen Gosch, and Noreen has been fighting a long, hard battle after her son Johnny Gosch was kidnapped, put in a pedophile ring. And basically, in the first half hour of this show, we documented those first days, showing without question the Des Moines Police Department was in the pocket of somebody higher up, and the police chief told his men to stand down when there was solid evidence on that first day that her son had been kidnapped. The story doesn't end there. It's been a long fight ever since that September 5th, 1982 morning when Johnny disappeared. And in the meantime, I want to mention this, that Noreen is one of the few mothers in this country that has walked the walk and talked the talk. She has gone and never stopped, gone the extra mile, never stopped in the face of government harassment, in the face of death threats. She never lost sight of the fact that she wanted her son back, and she knew that something higher up was going on. One point in the case, a man who's been on my show and is with us now, and I want both of them to speak together on this. came to help Noreen, came to her rescue in a sense to try to put his expertise in understanding pedophile rings from many years on the New York Police Department working in this area, when he was told and basically his life was threatened for getting to the bottom of these things, and that means getting to the top of it. And he's talked about how his investigations were quashed in the same manner. Jim, are you with me?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, Noreen, Jim is here, and I wanted Noreen to just...
Good morning, Noreen.
Noreen, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, so we got Jim and Noreen on. And Jim, we left off at a point where the police chief in Des Moines was decided to basically step down after Noreen threatened a $20 million lawsuit. We talked about this police activity in those first days. I just wanted to get your comments and about what Noreen talked about in the first half hour, what you saw as far as negligence on the part of the cops and what really went down and how this operated. Go ahead.
Well, a number of years after that, I personally contacted at the time the person that was in charge of the so-called investigation, and he told me that nothing was done. In fact, the composite drawing that they drew up was just drawn up to pacify the people. It actually wasn't based on anything. So basically what they did was steer the investigation completely off to the side so nothing could be done. And just a couple of years ago, I met with the investigator who's now in charge of the case, and he basically told me there's nothing that's going to be done. So, and Noreen remembers when I was out in West Des Moines and met with these people because we had a couple of meetings. So you can see that to this day, there is no investigation being done. And this happens in all these cases, or many of them at least, especially if they fall into this category that Johnny and the Martin boy and Wetterling and all these other kids were taking.
Okay, Noreen, how does Jim help you in this, understand some things? And together, I know you two are still trying to get to the truth. But go ahead, Noreen.
What was so helpful with Jim's expertise was the fact that he had, in fact, talked to the person in charge of the case at the police department and got the statement that they did nothing. It was one thing for the mom to say it, but it was very different to have absolute confirmation from another man who had been in the same profession and was a top investigator on these types of crimes. Jim has shared a lot of expertise in many situations that have come up since that time, including the latest visit with the man in charge now of Johnny's case, and also still got verification that they weren't going to do anything. That is very telling. That tells America what happened here. And it's vindication for me, for those who wanted to try to take me down or criticize because of what the former police chief had been saying about me.
Go ahead, Jim.
Well, we also have this contact in the missing and exploited children. And about a year and a half ago, he told me, he says, Jim, I now have to believe what you're telling me, that there's an active protection taking place here on certain cases that are not investigated. So even the missing and exploited people know that there's something going on here. And to me, that's a complete vindication, because when they started, what was ironic, I have been called on it, and guess what? They never brought me in on it, and at the time there was nobody in this country that had as much experience in this as I did. So now we know for a fact that this is going on.
All right. Now, in the first half hour, Noreen talked about how they did nothing in those first couple days. Tell us what you think was how this operated. How, the actions of the police chief were not the actions of a man who wanted to protect the community, but someone who was paid off, perhaps. How does this work? How did this police chief basically, how was he able to get this whole force to stand down when there was evidence showing that Johnny had been kidnapped?
Well, that's not hard to figure out. What usually happens there, and it doesn't generally involve payoffs, but some higher authority comes in and tells them, listen, this is a far bigger case. we're going to take this over, and we want you guys to stay out of it. And being a good doobie, following orders, the guy backs down. Although we are seeing that at the time there was further involvement with the police in this underground. And I believe that's going on to this day. And it definitely dovetails into the Omaha, Nebraska, Lincoln, Nebraska, and other parts of the country where this particular group has been operating for many, many years. In fact, there was an investigation done by one of the federal agencies from 1982 to 89 with 20 men assigned to it. And after the investigation, I personally interviewed this guy just a number of years ago who verified that 834 children were taken at that time, and nothing's ever been done.
Now, Jim, you've said in the past that this is the biggest terrorist threat that our country faces, that this problem has escalated since Johnny's kidnapping, that Johnny's case is a watershed case in a sense for people to really understand how these pedophile rings operate and how high up they really go. And you also said that Noreen has been probably the only mother that has stood up to these people and tried to get to the truth about their sons. Now, basically, our hope, you said, is for parents of other children who've been taken to all band together, that people who want to protect their children who haven't been taken yet to band together, and this is our only hope. And I wanted to get Noreen's comments about this and about what you've seen behind the scenes and why parents have been so silent, Noreen, and why you haven't. What is the difference between you and them?
I think the basic difference is fear. Many of them are terribly afraid to cross the line and question authority. And that becomes another whole issue. When it comes to something like that, I am no respecter of titles. If someone is hurting a child, if someone is covering up for the fact that a crime was committed, then I play on through. I don't take no for an answer. And I also was in a position where I did not have other small children at home. I was free to travel, free to go out on all the speaking engagements, rally people, do what I had to do to investigate. If I would have had other small children at home, it would have been much more difficult to do the traveling. But I do think in talking to other parents who have not stepped forward, like right here in Des Moines, there was 2 other kidnappings, I would have welcomed the help from the other families to band together to demand answers. But I think they were just overwhelmed by the police and they were told to shut up, and they did.
Now, Jim, you've seen this up close and personal with family members because you've investigated these cases from New York and from the East Coast to the West Coast. What's your take on this, and how can we get to the bottom? And that really means, how do we get to the top of who's still orchestrating these cases? What do we do?
Well, again, it goes back to information and the experience I got over the years of investigating these cases. At the time I was with the New York City Police Department, I traveled all over the United States to find out what was happening. And through this, I got to actually speak and work with people who were directly involved in this whole operation. And at one point, we had even worked with a group called the Policy Science Corporation, which was headed by a guy named Laswell, Harold Laswell. And I remember at one time asking him, I says, I'm doing all this. I'm trying to get something done, but it's you hit the stone wall. And he's the one that told me, like I said, these are things based on talking to a lot of people. And he's the one that told me you have to get the mothers to stand up and make the men and fathers do what they should do. And after all these years, and again, when I met Noreen, it was really refreshing that there was one mother who would stand up. And I do agree that many of them are threatened or told, and they believe in the system that the cops will do their job. But here's what happens. They're scared to say anything because they've been, you don't want to make the police mad, otherwise they're not going to investigate. Well, that's the greatest cover-up in the world. How can you make somebody mad that's not doing anything in the first place. And this is what the police use as an excuse not to work on this. But there's one other thing that comes into this is any police officer, federal agent, may it be the FBI, Customs, that works these types of cases, their careers are over. So you need, and there's plenty of cops out there that would do the right job. In fact, I've spoken to somebody just lately, and he told me it hasn't changed. And he says, if I take this type of cases, my career is over. So here's another point that we need the people to back the police that want to do their job. That detective I interviewed in Des Moines, Iowa, that has Johnny's case now, there'd be nothing more than, he'd like nothing better than to open this case up, but he can't. So this is where the problem comes in, and Noreen knows this better than anybody. She's been right there. The only thing is she hasn't backed down.
Exactly, and to talk about your point, Jim, just for a second, that there are good policemen out there, and there's even a former policeman that listens to my show from Portland and wants to get in touch with you guys. He worked on cases like this in Portland, Oregon. He's now retired, and he wants to lend assistance. And I will get there. Off the air, I will get him in touch with you, Jim, so you guys can talk. So there are people that want to stop this problem because, look, Johnny's been gone for I don't know how many years now. He's in his late 30s. I want to get to this aspect of the story. Never during this time did they ever really investigate this case and bring him home. And still to this day, Noreen, is Johnny still under their control? And talk about this last visit, because some people get confused. How could he come home and then leave again? What's going on? How did this occur? What is your son like now?
What we have learned and what we've been told by witnesses that knew Johnny and were kept with him during their captivity. One in particular told us that he and Johnny had run away. They stole a car to get away. And they went to this young man's father's home. I was able to make contact because the father called me. Johnny stayed there for a few days. He did not realize that it was my son at the time because he was going by another name. Mm-hmm. And his son just told him it was a kid that he met along the way. This boy's father had no idea it was a kidnapped child. They stayed at this boy's house for a few days. Then Johnny left, and this man told me that he heard him say that he was going to try to find a place to live on an Indian reservation. Mm-hmm. A short time after that, America's Most Wanted did our story. When the man saw Johnny's picture, he realized it was the same boy. And that's when he got in touch with me. And he was a well-respected CPA in Wisconsin. But his son was also a victim of this network, and that's how his son met my son.
How old
Johnny
was Johnny
then went to live on an Indian reservation as far as we knew. But they were free to a certain extent from the group that took them, probably because they were starting to outlive their usefulness. They weren't cute little boys anymore that might be desired by a pedophile. They had reached another stage of development.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What happened to him from that point, and how old was he?
From there, and that would have put him at his late teens, early 20s when they escaped. Then we lost track of him for a very, very long time. And I was able to do a lot of television appearances. I did one in California right before Christmas in 1996. And they asked me if I wanted to just give a personal message to Johnny. So they brought the camera in close, and my message to Johnny was that no matter what had happened to him, I loved him. And I would do whatever I could to help him. But I didn't know where he was. And my address was in the phone book because I had moved from our family home. And I said, my address is in the phone book. Contact me. Well, several months went by. And then one night, there was a knock at my door around 2 4:30 in the morning, and I went out and looked out the little security thing on my door, and there was 2 young men standing out in the hallway. And I said, "Who is it?" And he said, "It's me, Mom. It's Johnny." Now, that might not sound significant to anyone, but from the time Johnny was a little boy, if he ever came to, his brother or sister's room and they had the door closed, he'd knock and they'd say, "Who is it?" And he'd say, "It's me, it's Johnny." He used the same phrase. And I opened the door and I let them in. The one young man didn't say much of anything. Johnny's hair was long, dyed black, and he was deeply tanned, almost like he had darkened his skin with some tanning products. And he just went on to tell me what took place with him, how he was put into this ring, how he did break free. All of what I had been told was accurate, and that he and this other kid had been more or less on the run ever since. And I thought he was home to stay at that point. And he wasn't. He said he could only stay a short time, and then he would have to leave. And I offered to call my private investigator to see if we could figure out what to do and put him in someplace safe. And he said, "No, you don't understand." He said, "There is still a great deal of danger for me and for you if I were to come back. They don't want me telling my story." And
okay, Jim,
so he left.
Then he leaves, and Johnny was in his mid-30s then. Okay.
Yeah.
Jim, what happened to him at that point? What kind of control was he still under from your perspective as a detective in this? What was going on there?
Well, we know for a fact, I've seen it many times, once these boys are taken, you have 72 hours to get them back. And if you don't, and then even if you do, if the police officials that do this don't know what they're doing, they will never get the kid back. The kid will disappear again. But in Johnny's particular case, we were able to verify through a government source that he had in fact been brought to Chicago to lay the groundwork for Johnny going to see Noreen. So we know this is controlled, and it's been my experience, and in many cases I have personally interviewed people who were in the underground, and much of the information, in fact all of the information that Noreen had on Johnny fits in what my investigations had disclosed over the years. The Indian reservation and all that. There were many things that we verified, and this is why when people say, "Why did he go to the police?" Well, why would he go to the police? In most cases, the police haven't done anything. So I don't know what police he would have went to help him, because there were none. And this is what happens, and this is why people have to understand this. We need help.
Exactly. Now, Johnny comes back for those few minutes with Noreen, then leaves again, saying that there's still, "I can't stay, Mom, because you could be killed, I could be killed." What kind of control, what happened, what are they doing to him to this day to prevent him? Basically, they're basically saying, "You talk and you're dead," right?
Well, not only is he dead, but the family. And again, I always like to use cases that I personally saw. We had a guy commit suicide in New York. And when we investigated, we found out that he'd been kidnapped at the age of 13 in Texas. And when we got to him, he was probably in his early 30s. And he was never able to go back. But he ended up committing suicide because his lover cheated on him. But so we know that this happens. And there were plenty of other cases where guys just never went home, or they'll go there and then disappear again. We know that there's a well-established underground where these people can survive in.
All right. And so his life is in danger if he ever tries to come forward, and he really has nobody protecting him. The FBI to this day isn't helping, in a sense. Noreen, you had an experience with them. I don't know how, it wasn't that far, many years ago, when you actually got so upset with the FBI, with the officer who didn't want to do anything, that you threw a cup of coffee in his face. Tell us about that experience. So where can he go? Go ahead.
Yes, there had been another kidnapping that took place in Des Moines, and it was a very rich family, and the FBI jumped in and they got the boy back in 36 hours. Then they came over to my home. Herb Hawkins was the special agent. He was in charge of the whole 5-state region. And he came walking into our house and he said, "Oh boy, that was a tough case. We really had to work hard on that one." And he said there was a human life at stake. And I said, "Well, what do you call Johnny?" He said, "Well, now, Mrs. Gosch, you're going to have to understand the other family was much more prominent than you are. You have to realize that we had to enter that case and not Johnny's." And that's what that fool said to me. And I was standing at the counter pouring coffee for everyone, and I picked up the cup and hurled it across the room. I missed his head by about an inch.
Good for you. What a statement.
And then I ordered them out of the house, and he said, "Well, we can see that you're overwrought." I said, "No, I'm not overwrought. I am so disgusted. I'm about ready to throw up on you listening to what you just said, how the other family's prominence and money made the difference as to why you entered that case and not Johnny's." I said, "Get out." And I threw them out of the house, and that was the last conversation I had with an FBI agent.
Now, we only have a few minutes left, but I promise in the weeks to come we'll have both of you on again. And my hope is from this perspective, I know this show, I know that you don't get much publicity anymore in the mainstream. They want to cover this story up, but hopefully the publicity that we get can prevent other children from being taken. And secondly, my hope is that Johnny will be able to come home because they won't have any choice. And I'll tell you this, that is my hope, that someday you can see him and live normally, because they have ruined your life. I mean, I don't know any other way to say it. They've taken your son away from you. Then they dangle him in front of you when he's in his mid-30s. And then he tells you this. I don't know how you've been able to survive, Noreen. In the last minute, tell us from deep within inside your heart, what's kept you going? I mean, this is almost worse than death itself.
I have a very positive outlook. I have a very deep spiritual faith. But I also remembered every day who was the true victim, and that was Johnny, not me. And I did not internalize victimization, because sometimes if you do that, it weakens you because you then become a victim. And I knew that Johnny was the ultimate victim throughout this whole time.
A very good advice for those of you out there who've experienced any kind of loss that may help. Jim Rothstein, last minute here. Your thoughts, can we ever get Johnny back home living a normal life, or have they basically done him in for good? I know that's not a good way to say it, but I don't know any other way to do it. Can we get him home?
Yes, and I can, if the right people are listening, I can tell you that I do have the connection now, that if he was to come forward, or any other person in this, that I do have the connections now that he can be helped, or whoever it is, and that something will be done.
Okay.
The word is out.
All right. Jim and Noreen, I want to thank you. We're all out of time. We will have you on in a couple of weeks. Good morning and welcome to the Wednesday, July 8th, 2009 edition of the Investigative Journal. I'm your host, Greg Szymanski. You're listening to LibertyRadioLive.com, and my two guests today are return guests, Noreen Gosch and former New York Police Detective Jim Rothstein. We're going to pick up where we left off a couple of weeks ago when we talked to Noreen and Jim. Noreen, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, and Jim, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, Greg. Thanks for having me on again. Good morning, Noreen.
Good morning,
okay,
Jim.
let me just tell you this for the program. If my internet connection should fail, Jim and Noreen, just take over till I come back. Just in case. I've had a couple of internet problems in the last couple of days. I just wanted to say that. Secondly, try to stay as close to the phone as you can, and do not use a speakerphone so we can hear the connection. Okay?
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, let's start out with Noreen. Noreen, just recap the story about your son. And I know there's a couple things you wanted to get to right away. And then, Jim, of course, if you have any questions or want to chime in, just go right ahead. Go ahead, Noreen. Just tell the listeners so we can pick up where we left off and they have a little background of what happened to your son.
Okay. Well, Johnny was kidnapped on September 5th, 1982. He was delivering his Sunday morning newspapers, and a man pulled up asking for directions, but then Johnny did not speak with him. He walked away. As Johnny walked a little further down the block, another man came out from behind 2 trees and followed him. The driver of the car started up his engine, took off, came around behind that block, and the next thing that the witnesses knew, they saw the car run the stop sign and head north out of town, and Johnny was gone. They managed to kidnap him in about 9 minutes flat from the time he left the house.
And this one, Johnny was about 12 years old. This happened in the early 80s. And
Yes.
There's never been any type of really serious investigation. I thought Jim would just tell us a little bit about what went wrong that first day.
Well, going back to that time, when I first got involved, I spoke to the lead detective or captain, whoever he was in charge. And basically, after I told him who I was and what I did, he admitted to me that nothing was done. He said, in fact, even the composite drawing they made up was just a fake thing to pacify the people and make them believe that they were doing something. So, and that's been 2 years ago when I was out there. The detective that is now doing in the investigation basically told me that nothing's going to happen, even with new information that's coming in.
Right. And what you've told us, Jim, in the past is that this could be the biggest terrorist threat facing our country. And there's something we need to do about it, and nothing has been done. And you've investigated these crimes to the highest levels when you worked with New York and never got a complete investigation. You investigated to the highest levels of the Vatican, highest levels of our government officials, and always the investigations were stopped. I was wondering, at this particular juncture, Noreen, do you still, I know you've started an organization, do you still hold out hope that people will wake up and end this pedophilia ring that's stealing many children in our country still to this day?
Yes, I still have the Johnny Gosch Foundation, and what we try to do is continue the investigation on Johnny's case as the information still comes in, because my hope is that we will be able to uncover and expose, at least at the local level, the trafficking network that was operating and taking children, which has not ever stopped. But if no one gets involved and no one does anything, then future generations, innocent children, are at risk. And many of us who were raising our kids back at that particular time frame, many people now have little grandchildren. And the threat goes on because those children are just as vulnerable as the ones that were exposed and or kidnapped back in the 80s.
You know, before we get into some of the particulars I know that you want to bring up today regarding your son's case, I wanted to ask Jim just to tell the listeners the seriousness of this problem, what you found out as a longtime New York police and detective working in trying to uncover pedophilia rings. Tell us a little bit about what you found out and the seriousness of this problem and how deeply embedded this is into the highest levels of the two organizations we mentioned earlier. Go ahead.
Well, as you know, Greg, we started back in the late 60s, and it took many twists and turns. It involved the occult. It involved many of our politicians. It involved many of the religious to the highest levels. And in every case, when we followed up, and there were plenty of police officers who wanted to do a legitimate investigation, but in each and every case, it was stopped. And to this day, and even now, it's gotten worse. You add another dimension to this, the computer, and the use of the internet where they can now send this information out within split second, it's gotten far worse. And there's far less enforcement. You do every once in a while here, which amazed me, is that the FBI finally looked at the part of the trucking industry involved in this, which I'd like to get into as we go along here, is the information that we got on the Johnny Gosch kidnapping, on how a federal investigation was conducted back then, but it never saw the light of day. And currently, if you're watching the news, all these kids are disappearing at a bigger rate. And what's interesting even more so is you never hear what the solutions are. And we know that this has gotten worse and worse just from the stuff that me and Noreen have done and what we hear from people who are victims of these crimes.
Yeah, now let's go over some of the new things that you found out about Johnny's case. Jim, is there anything that you wanted to tell us?
Yes, in particular, we've been getting information in the last couple of weeks. We found somebody who seems to be doing a very good job of exposing some of this stuff, and it had to do with the trucking industry and a kiddie program where these truck drivers would take kids along. Now, that in itself is a good idea, but there's been mentions made of trucking people who weren't that legitimate, which brings to light a situation in Johnny's case, and Noreen would know the date when this guy came forward. But there was an incident where a truck was stopped in Mexico, and lucky they went to the government, they went to the embassy with it, and that started an investigation which led to a trucking outfit that was involved in, or the people in the trucking company were involved in Johnny's case. And how this worked was they had people working there that would go around and set up these kidnappings. As we know in Johnny's case, before the Martin boy was taken, Noreen had gotten information this was going to happen, and the cops did absolutely nothing about it. Then we find in the Wetterling case, the same thing. These trucking people showed up, and they grabbed the wrong kid, or the kid they grabbed originally escaped from them, so they took Wetterling instead. And this latest development is big because we are finding all kinds of connections now with the trucking thing. And I don't believe that it's used in every case, but it's just another part of this bigger problem. That investigation that was done by a federal agency, they actually had come up with 1,500 kids. But out of this, 834 were actually kidnapped and put into this underground, which to me is just devastating. And that investigation was done from 82 to 89 by 20 people. And I have personally talked to the guy that was the head of it. So, and Noreen has met him too. So
Noreen, you've also go ahead. You've also mentioned, Noreen, that you have some new information on the local level in Des Moines regarding your son's case. Tell us about that.
What we've been able to do is tap into the user level, not the kidnappers, but the next level, which is the ones who create the supply and demand, the people who would not go to a street corner and risk kidnapping a child themselves for their own use. They will pay because they have the means, the money, the power to do so. And a couple of months ago, we received some extremely good information, which has all been accurate. So we're pursuing in that area. It's not complete yet. We still have more to do.
Okay, back to Jim for a moment here. Jim, you've said that this problem is not going to go away, and you've given recommendations in the past on how to maybe correct this problem. First of all, I think people need to understand that it could be their kid next. You've always said that the Johnny Gosch case is a very good case to look at. It represents how many other kids, hundreds, thousands, have been kidnapped over the years. So let's go into the particulars of what needs to be done in the beginning. Noreen just talked about this user level. I think if you dry up the user level, you're going to take away the incentive for the people who actually do the kidnappings for money, correct?
Yes, that is definitely true. And that's one of the biggest problems we have. Nobody wants to go after the users because these users many times are very influential people. And not only that, is they're also very adept at compromising other people to cover this stuff up. And that is the heart of our problem. The second part of that is the initial law enforcement involvement where a detective or police officer will go out and do his job, but then is interfered with by higher-ups, maybe be in law enforcement or from the outside. And then you do also have the police officers who realize that if they do anything with this, their careers are over with. So that is where those are the two major problems. You need to have something to make the police officer do his job and then also punish anybody who interferes with him. And second of all, the users, there has to be a concentrated effort to identify these users. We were able to do this in an investigation that we had done during the 70s with the New York City Police Department, the FBI, the Internal Revenue Service, and a number of police agencies around the country. And that was only because we found some police officers in Minneapolis, Columbus, Ohio, Chicago, New York, and other parts of the country that were dedicated and didn't care who they took on.
Right, and when you got to that level, the investigations then were quashed by the New York District Attorney, like you've talked on other shows. He's still, yeah. I think he's still there today, Mr. Morgenthau, but he's leaving office, I believe.
Yes, thank goodness he's finally quitting.
Right, here's the point. In your case, people that are listening, right here you have two people on both ends of this story. Jim, the police investigator trying to get to the truth. Noreen, one of the few parents in this country who has taken the extra mile, never quit on trying to find her son through a tremendous amount of pressure. So we see here, we have Jim who, let's talk about what happened to both of these people. Let's start with Noreen. We have Noreen Gosch, whose son was kidnapped. There was a shoddy police investigation from the beginning. They didn't want to get to the truth. They were covering up things from day one. When within hours, people knew that he was kidnapped. The police ignored it, allowed these people just to get away in the first 72 hours, which Jim Rothstein said is critical, because if you don't find these kids within the first couple days, the chances grow quite slim that you'll ever find them. So the police officer in Des Moines, the head of the department, he covers it up. And I think what we're going to do now is show what in two methods here, Noreen. First, tell us, and don't leave out any organizational names, people that are listening need to understand at your local level in Des Moines how all of these organizations, the newspaper he worked for, the police department, the FBI, and then even religious organizations like churches who preach God and the gospel didn't come to your rescue. Everybody seemed to just forget about it and listen to the liars that were controlling this investigation from the top. Tell us about that, and tell us some of the organizations that need to be exposed for the responsibility of taking your son's life away from you and him.
In the West Des Moines area, it starts with the police chief at that time, Orville Cooney. He was the one making the decisions on the case at that level, his jurisdiction. He, and Jim can verify this, he was called the morning of the kidnapping and told not to take action, basically to stand down. And that means nobody was looking for Johnny except his family. Now, whoever made that call had some power to wield because they could call off a whole police department. The police chief then made statements and contacted the editor of the Des Moines Register. And the editor of the Des Moines Register went into the newsroom and told all of the reporters that as they cover the Gosch case, they were being instructed to slant every article against the parents. And a reporter that worked down there contacted me and told me what the editor did. His name was James Gannon. He's no longer here in Des Moines, but that's what he did. The FBI did not come in because the police chief told them he did not want their help. The state police had a presence there during meetings, but they weren't doing anything. So when you can control that many aspects that would be involved in a case, you control the case. Same thing happened in Omaha, Nebraska with the Franklin case. As all of that unfolded, the media was controlled, the police were being controlled. Everybody that wanted to use this as a cover-up in Johnny's case all had a part in this. And I know that sounds like it's way out there or something that would be made for a movie or a CSI program, but that is exactly what happens in human trafficking networks. And this was the early days of human trafficking as we know it now.
Okay, let me switch over to Jim. You heard what Noreen said, and tell us if this is typical in other investigations that you have worked on throughout the years.
Oh, most definitely. Personally, the cases that I worked on, even after the governor of New York put myself and my partner, Matty Rosenthal, on the New York State Select Committee on Crime with a mandate to look at the effects these crimes were having on society, the biggest obstacle we had was the New York City Police Department. And let's bring this up to the present date. Just last week, I called a Detective Wong with the Milwaukee Police Department and told him about some guy that just died by the name of Vernon Seitz. I had personally interviewed Vernon Seitz, and Vernon Seitz himself was a victim at a young age where he participated in a sacrifice where he was involved in killing a little child for sacrificial purposes. And I called this detective because Vernon Seitz started talking about his involvement and his knowledge of Jeffrey Dahmer, Berkowitz, the son of Sam killer, and some other things that I was very familiar with in Wisconsin. And this guy started basically playing me for a fool. And we said, you've got the search warrant returns, and in it verifies all the things that we said that he told us in our interviews. So even to the present day, and people should call this detective and ask him what's going on. If you need his phone number, I even got that. But this is the type of thing, and it happens to this day. He made a big joke out of it. And it's just over and over and over. They make fun of Noreen. They accuse her. In fact, when the pictures came up, there were people accusing Noreen of this. And they didn't know that I also had gotten a couple of these pictures at the same time. So they try to ridicule the parents, number one, or try to put the blame on them so that they can cover it up. So it's a perfect plan that they have, and it works because so far Noreen is the only mother that I have ever met that has stood up to these people. And we need more mothers. It's only the mothers that can bring this to a stop.
Okay, now in the second half hour, we're going to spend a lot of time concentrating on when the Johnny Gosch case really heated up, when all these pictures started to surface. And we're going to get into that aspect of the case. We only have a couple minutes before the break. But, Jim, I wanted to mention that when you were investigating, your story, and we've documented it point by point, but I'm just going to recap it real quickly. when you finally began to take this investigation to the top levels, having solid evidence, for example, you had solid evidence the former Cardinal Spellman was involved, solid evidence that high-level officials in state and federal government were involved, businessmen, high-level businessmen. When you went with your information to get a search warrant, it was quashed by Morgenthau. In fact, he stole your evidence. And then as the days went on, when you worked with Father Ritter, and the connections with Pope John Paul I and his death, and actually listening to a conversation of the Pope who was killed after 33 days, trying to get some justice. He was then killed 10 days later after he made that call while you were in Father Ritter's office at the Covenant House. Father Ritter trying to get justice himself and then being slandered, libeled, called a pedophile by these people. They told you point blank, you either leave the department or you know what's going to happen to you. And that was the end of it all. And it got to that point after bribe after bribe. They tried to bribe you with $1 million. But isn't it amazing that when you got to the doorstep of Spellman and to the doorstep of these people, somehow the heat was turned up on you, Ritter, and John Paul I was killed? Just a comment. We got a minute.
Yes, and that is the problem. And you'll find many, many police officers, FBI agents, who have done the same thing I have. It's not that I was the Lone Ranger out there. Many, many police, to this day yet, like I just said, when I was in West Des Moines the last time and sat down with the detective, he was just besides himself that he knew he couldn't do anything. And he flat out told me. So I've talked to federal agents in the last year or so who have told me the same thing. He said, Jim, if I take this case or take these cases, my career's done. And so we know this is the problem. This is the whole problem. And this is why we need the mothers to stand up and make the fathers and the parents do what they're supposed to do to protect their children.
One question I never asked you, but when you were investigating this, and still to this day, you're doing private work, helping Noreen, other parents, try and find their children. Is there a concentrated area in the states they work in, or is this all over the country?
This is all over the country with a few locations that are specific to certain operations. Minneapolis. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to take a break. Let's hold it there so you don't get caught up when the music starts. My guests are Jim Rothstein, former New York police detective, Noreen Gosch. Back 3 minutes on the Investigative Journal. Okay, we are back on the Investigative Journal. My guests are Noreen Gosch, and she's from Des Moines, Iowa. Her story you can find at johnnygosch.com. She also has another website that she will tell you about. And I want to mention this first about Noreen. First of all, Jim Rothstein, who's been investigating pedophilia rings for years, first starting out as a detective in the New York Police Department, now doing it privately after he has been banished for the department for trying to get to the truth and help people recover their children. Noreen is perhaps one of the only mothers that has walked the extra mile here, never backing down to the pressure. And the pressure she's received from higher authorities is amazing. And it goes on with other people. Other people crack. They basically, some people I imagine have even committed suicide over this. And Jim has talked about that in the past. Now, we have a serious problem, probably what Jim Rothstein calls the biggest terrorist threat in our country. That is the kidnapping of our children. And this pedophilia ring is continuing today. Jim says even worse. And we are now faced with trying to figure out what to do. When we have a media, a group like the Des Moines Register, proposing to get at the truth, and then we go to bigger newspapers, bigger radio stations, TV stations that ignore this problem and give the benefit of the doubt to the government, we have a bigger problem because Americans really do not rally behind Jim Rothstein and Noreen Gosch, and they're left out in the cold by themselves. And I hope that people listening will contact them, lend their assistance in any way possible, and make sure that it doesn't happen in your community. Noreen, I wanted to get back to Jim just to answer those last questions, and then we're going to pick up the story where all these photos of Johnny started coming in when he was a child. It must have been heart-wrenching. Let's get back to that in a minute. But, Jim, we left off. You were saying that there are certain areas of the country they use for certain pedophilia purposes. Explain that a bit.
Yes, there are a number of locations. We'll start off with New York City. In the New York City area, naturally, because of its size and location, is one of the main centers. You have Washington, D.C., basically because of the politicians and the power that's there. From there, it spreads north. Boston had a major problem. You run through the Schenectady, Rochester, New York area. Then you get into Cleveland, Columbus, Ohio. You have New Orleans. Then you have the Chicago. You have Minneapolis. From Minneapolis, it goes to a place called St. John's, which is in St. Joe, Minnesota. And you head down to Des Moines, and I put Des Moines with Omaha, Nebraska. You have the Denver, Colorado area with the surrounding communities there. But the one part that has not come out before is where the occult part of this settled in a place called Kanab, Utah. Then you have Northern California. There's an area in there that's very much involved. And then you have the part around Los Angeles, Hollywood area, naturally because of what you have in that particular thing where they use these kids, promising them all kinds of stuff. And there's also a connection in Texas. So basically what you have there is the different areas that this focuses on. Although many little areas have what I call like these subcultures that are into it. They're small little areas in small communities many times. And always I like to give an example. When I was up in Island Falls, Maine, I had two priests come to me where a mother came to them and people had come and wanted to sacrifice her 6-year-old child up there. So we have this throughout the country. And you can follow this across. There's been another detective from New York working with a professor from St. Cloud State in Minnesota that have called and uncovered what's known as the smiley face killers. I used to call that the Interstate 9094, which gets into the occult part or satanic, whatever you want to call it, that crisscrosses and mixes with this other part. And a lot of that has to do what's known as human compromise, where these children are used to compromise people. So that gives you a quick outlook on just what this is, and it would take a show to describe each one of these.
Okay, back to Noreen. Noreen, the case took a turn when all these photos started to come in. Jim was involved at this point. Let's go back to that point and tell us how that occurred.
Okay. The first photos that I received was on August 27th, 2006. And it was a Sunday morning, and it was a picture of Johnny bound and gagged. There was another photograph of 3 boys on a bed, all bound and gagged. And then there was the picture of a man. It was a black and white photo, kind of a rough-looking photo, and the man appeared to be dead in the picture. And I didn't know it at the time, but apparently there were 4 or 5 other people that also received the same packet of pictures. And the one photograph of the boy alone that was bound and gagged, that photograph was definitely Johnny.
And how old was Johnny when you received the photo in 2006? He was kidnapped in the early 80s. How old was he when this picture was taken? Did you figure that out?
We think that he was photographed, and that picture was only maybe a few hours or a couple of days after he was kidnapped. Because
okay.
And what we were looking at that point was naturally his features and everything, but the length of his hair was exactly the same as it was at the time he was kidnapped. And then there were more pictures that surfaced as the months went on of many children. We've got over 500 pictures now. Not all of them are Johnny. There's a few in the batches of pictures that are Johnny. We have a few photos that actually show a perpetrator in the photo with a child. And those have all been made available to the FBI in Washington. I bypassed the local law enforcement here.
Yeah, good idea. Jim, where did these photos come from? Because I know you work closely with Noreen on this case, this part of the case.
We don't exactly know where they came from. We know who gave them to us or how they got here. Tim White was involved with that. And at the same time, though, another batch of pictures showed up in Omaha. And I was alerted to it, but because of the natures of the pictures, I couldn't get the backing I needed because it would have depicted what could be considered child pornography. And if I would have went and picked them up, I would have been a sitting duck to get arrested with these pictures. And they were available to us for 72 hours. And then they went underground again. So there was more out there. And we don't really know why this came to happen, but it had to do with a lot of things that Noreen and myself were working on that finally got somebody to bring it out.
Okay, did those pictures lead to anything else, Noreen, in this case? I mean, the pictures start coming out. What happened afterwards?
Well, I posted a number of the pictures of the children on my website, which is www.johnnygosch.com. And from that, we've been getting calls on a regular basis where somebody will remember something or they'll have some information they want to share. We also shared the photographs with the National Center for Missing Children in hopes to identify some of the kids that were unknown to us. And so it has generated information to come our way. And that's the good thing about a website. It's accessible to people anywhere in the world.
Yeah, and I know that, and this is a question I've always failed to ask, is that throughout your quest to get your son back, you've met a lot of other people in the same situation as you. Can you tell us about some of those experiences, some of the other people who found themselves in the same boat as you?
The story is almost replicated identically in cases where children were kidnapped, boys or girls, and police departments just more or less shut down. The parents were left with the biggest do-it-yourself package they've ever encountered. Lack of funds is what stops most investigations, and just plain fear and exhaustion with the parents. Many times the law enforcement tells the parents just to keep quiet. But I've been in touch with parents all over the country over the years, and the story is about the same. When the police chief told me to just stay at home and not talk to the media or anything, I didn't listen to him. That was my child. But many people are very afraid of somebody with a title and a badge and a gun. And they will just back down. And that's what they count on. When they involve a police department in a cover-up, they count on parents backing down.
And the unfortunate thing, as Jim Rothstein has found out, most parents do. And, Jim, what can we do to encourage people to stay in this fight a little bit longer and not to believe authority? Many people fall, like Noreen said, are frightened of an FBI badge. What do you recommend?
Well, this is very true. And that was one of the reasons we were successful at that time. And I say we because I wasn't the only detective that worked this in New York City. It was that we listened to the people. We dealt with them. We did not lie to them. And you're going to find another phenomena here that comes out where you'll see these parents of these victims are placated to believing they're doing a great thing. They're given TV shows. They're given positions and form organizations and all this, and oh, you're doing great now. Don't say anything. We'll take care of it. Well, in the meantime, all they're doing is shutting them up, and the people, and I've heard this hundreds of times from parents. Oh, I can't say nothing. The cops will get mad at me, and then they won't investigate. The opposite is true. Be on their case. Go public. Let them know. Give the cops names. And the greatest thing of all is, I can't use the words to express it because they'd shut you down, but cops sit there and tell you, we can't talk about this. It's an ongoing investigation. Ask the cop, show me that law that says you can't talk about this. This is what happens. The people are conned, and they get to believe in, this feel-good thing, the cops are really doing their job, when they're doing the exact opposite. And that's why I say Noreen's case is so important. They tried that with her, and Noreen basically ran him right out of her house. And this is what people should do. And then go to the media, and the ones that will even write something about it, or the national television. But most of all, it's people like you, Greg, who have these talk shows that get the story out there, and we need more of that on a higher level.
Yeah, and like you said before, this problem's not going to go away. And like Noreen said, she's not going to stop trying to get to the truth about what happened to her son, as well as in the process helping other people find their lost children, as well as trying to stop it from happening right today. And, one of the things that I always remember, Jim, when you were on my show one time, you mentioned, as we're speaking today, you can be rest assured, and Jim, these are your words paraphrased, that there are children being kidnapped right during the time we're speaking right now somewhere in this country. That's not an exaggeration, is it?
No, it's not. And again, I like to give examples. When I first moved back here to Minnesota, there was a lady who came to me from a town about 50 miles north. Her child had been missing for 8 years. And I said, why didn't you go to the police? She says, well, we knew they weren't going to do anything, and we thought they'd come after us. And I said this lady, well, where'd you get my name? She says, we knew about you from the cases you had out here before. We had another thing where a girl was killed in New York, and I knew she was from a town called Rockville, Minnesota. And when we contacted the local authorities that we had a body, but I didn't have the name, they never found the parents, or whoever it was, never reported their child missing. So this just goes on. We had another case where a guy in New York committed suicide, and when we followed it back, we found out he was like 30 years old when he committed suicide, that he in fact had been kidnapped at the age of 13 in Texas. So this is the way it works. And It is a sad case when people can't go to law enforcement.
All right. There's a part of the Johnny Gosch case that always stands out, and I get a lot of emails regarding this, and I wanted both you and Noreen to explain it. There was a time, and this was not long ago, and Johnny is now in his late 30s, correct me if I'm wrong, but he returned home and spoke to his mother. It was the first time they saw each other for years. And I received a number of emails saying, well, how can this be? I mean, why didn't, what's going on here? Why did he come back? How could he come back? Didn't the police want to find out exactly everything he knew? What was really going on here? I think it's an aspect of the case that Noreen, just explain what happened. And then, Jim, give us your professional opinion of how something like this could occur. Go ahead, Noreen.
Okay. I was on a network television program in 1996, December, and they allowed me to give a personal message to Johnny. So the camera came in close, and I said, Johnny, I still live in West Des Moines. I'm not in the house you were raised in. Contact me. I will help you in any way I can. My number is in the phone book. Well, 3 months later, 3.5 months, I think it was, March of 1997, he appeared. 2:30 in the morning, there was a knock on my door. And I went to the door, and there were two young men standing out in the hallway. And I said, "Who is it?" And the one young man said, "It's me, Mom, it's Johnny." Now, he was back only for a short time, responding to the TV show that he had seen. And he wanted my help in trying to expose this crime. I thought he was home to stay. He wasn't. He explained that there was no way that he could stay because it would put not only himself in danger, but me. Because
now,
there were
during
people
these
that would want to kill him.
Right.
So
now, it's been
after a couple of hours, then he and this other young man left. And I went straight to the county attorney. I made an appointment for that very next week and went in and talked with him and told him the information that Johnny shared with me.
Now, that's almost 11 years ago. Have you seen him since?
No, I have not.
Now, Jim Rothstein, how can this occur? Okay, here we have a definite kidnapping. He's put in a pedophilia ring. How did this happen from your professional opinion so people can understand this? Go ahead.
Well, the way this works is, and in particular in this instance with Johnny, I personally interviewed a man who was sent to Chicago to meet and set up the rules for Johnny to go visit his mother. So this was a very well-planned thing, and Johnny knew exactly what the rules were that he could go home and visit. So anybody who says that this is not true doesn't know what they're talking about. Very few instances does this happen, but it does happen. I had another case where a young boy many, many years later showed up, was there for a couple of hours, and disappeared again. Those people know that there is no way they can come out of the cold in those instances. We did have a couple of years ago where we believed we had the arrangement set up that some of these guys were coming out, including Johnny. But somebody got arrested, and it scared them, and they went back underground. This stuff, very, very seldom do they ever come back out.
Now, tell us why they'd allow this to occur in the first place, and secondly, what do you suppose these rules were that he had to adhere to?
Well, the rules were that he couldn't go to the police. And first of all, going to the police would be signing a death knell. I mean, first of all, they covered it up to start with. What would they do if he came out of the cold? It's just something that don't happen. In all the cases I've worked on, nobody directly came out. We had a number of instances where we did have contact with kids who had been taken. We never could find out from where, but we knew this was particularly true in New York City, where there were thousands of these type of kids, and they just don't go home. It just don't happen.
All right, so I've thought about this aspect of the story, and tell me if I'm right or wrong with one of the analyses I had. I said, well, what do they benefit by allowing Johnny to go home, knowing Noreen has a case that's probably one that they want to quiet her from talking anymore, so to speak, like they've tried to for years. And I said, well, why would they benefit? Well, I thought, well, maybe they're thinking, well, anybody looking at the Gosch case can see that her son just walked into her house. What's she complaining about? You see what kind of kid he is? He just comes and goes when he pleases, right? Is that a bad analysis, or is that a reason behind the scenes why they did this?
No, that is a bad analysis because
he
knew he could only go home to visit for a very short period of time. And I believe it was a message that to anybody else that we control this. There is no way out.
Okay. And I was just saying it from a point of view of how someone would look at this.
Oh, yes, you're right. That's very, very true, Greg. You hit the nail on the head, and that was the message.
Right, because somebody would look at this and go, well, you see, there he is. What's, from the outside in, that's, I think that's the impression people will get. And I just wanted to make sure we can dispel that. Because, Jim, from your experience, if Johnny ever tried to come home for good, that would maybe sign a death warrant for his mother as well, wouldn't it?
Yes, unless, and I believe we now have the capabilities of taking care of that. That if somebody wants to come out, that we can handle that and assure them that nothing will happen to the parents or anybody else.
Okay.
I feel free to say that now.
Okay, we have several minutes left, Noreen. So if you haven't seen your son since that, tell us some of the major things that have transpired in those 11 years, if you can, before we part company here. Go ahead.
Well, some of the things that have come up since that time were obviously the photographs, and that created a huge change in the case because it did show that children were being held, tied up, bound, gagged, photographed. The photographs are traded like baseball cards among pedophiles. There are photographs that are much worse than the ones that were displayed of Johnny, much more pornographic in nature. But it is a big business, and they can do it all by internet now. So it's a money-making proposition for the pedophile. That was huge. From those pictures, other information has come about that we can follow up on, and the latest being the information that we've been able to tie back to the 80s on the trucking industry, and now the local user level present right here in Des Moines, Iowa, and probably present in most major cities.
Okay. Jim, we have a minute or so. Tell us exactly where you're at in this investigation to someday bring Johnny back. I mean, do you still have hope?
Yes, adding to what Noreen has said, just in the last 2-3 days, we've made another big connection with some people working the smiley face killer thing that has given us another insight into this operation. And I feel we are closer now than we've ever been, and I think that there's going to be some stuff coming out soon. The only way we can do this, we need people to support and help us do this. It can't be done by one or two people themselves.